Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you grateful for your minty toothpaste and plastic bristled toothbrush. You're about to wake up in a time when dental hygiene meant rubbing ash on your teeth and praying to a saint when the pain started. We're going back to the Middle Ages, where the mornings were foggy, the beds were scratchy, and your mouth tasted like a sheepfold at sunrise. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a medieval cottage, if you're lucky, or maybe a smoky hall with 40 other villagers sharing the same air. The first thing you notice isn't the rooster, it's your mouth. Your tongue feels like it's been mummified overnight. The taste? A strange blend of dried meat, sour ale, and the remnants of whatever herb you chewed before bed to ward off evil. You sit up from your straw mattress, and your breath greets you with the warmth of stale onions. There's no running water, no ceramic sink, and definitely no toothpaste commercial soundtrack. Just a wooden bucket of cold water and a rag that smells like old cabbage. But here's the thing, you're not just going to sit there with your medieval morning breath. You've got a plan. Sort of. Beside your sleeping mat is a thin twig, the end chewed into fibrous threads. This isn't some dental innovation, it's a tooth twig, and people all across the Middle East, Asia, and bits of Europe are using something like it. You pop the frayed end into your mouth and begin rubbing it along your teeth. There's no brushing in circular motions, no 2-minute timer, just vigorous scrubbing and a silent hope you're not making things worse. Some of these twigs, like the miswak used in the Islamic world, actually have antimicrobial properties. Others are just sticks. It really depends on where you live and what tree you're willing to nibble on before breakfast. Willow and hazel twigs are common, and occasionally someone gets fancy and chews on a piece of licorice root, which isn't too bad if you ignore the splinters. As you rub your teeth with your stick, you catch your reflection in a shard of polished metal. Your gums look puffy. There's something dark between two of your front teeth. You consider digging it out with your fingernail, but decide against it. You saw what happened to Thomas when he poked too far. He hasn't eaten solid food in a week, and his cheek still smells like curdled butter. To be fair, not everyone in the Middle Ages had awful teeth. In fact, historians still argue whether medieval Europeans had better dental health than modern junk food lovers. The lack of refined sugar definitely helped. You're not sipping sodas or chewing gummy worms all day. Your meals are mostly grain-based porridge, root vegetables, and the occasional tough slab of meat. It's not glamorous, but it doesn't rot your teeth as fast. Still, there's no fluoride. No dental checkups. And when a molar goes bad, it really goes bad. You've heard tales of people drilling into their own teeth with iron nails, or having a tooth pulled out by tying it to a door and slamming it. That's on the dramatic end. Most folks just live with the pain until it either goes away or takes them with it. You rinse your mouth with a bit of water. Cold, metallic tasting, and probably full of things you don't want to think about. But it's better than nothing. You might also chew on a few fresh mint leaves if they're in season. Or parsley, which isn't just a garnish here, it's your best shot at halitosis control. Sometimes you'd rub crushed sage or thyme along your gums. Not for flavor, though it's not terrible, but because you heard that herbs could ward off rot. One village over, someone swears by crushed charcoal mixed with salt. The guy lost most of his teeth before 30, but swears the mix gives him the breath of angels. You're not convinced. Oh, and mouthwash? Let's just say you're better off not asking. Some folks use vinegar. Others try wine diluted with water. There's even a rumor, hushed and whispered, that someone once gargled with aged urine. It kills everything, they said, including, presumably, your sense of dignity. And yet, here you are, scraping your teeth with a twig, gargling questionable liquids, and hoping your mouth holds together for another market day. Because in the medieval world, dental hygiene is like weather forecasting, you do your best and pray a storm doesn't come. So, you've done your best with the stick this morning. It's time for the next phase in your medieval oral hygiene ritual, which sounds fancier than it is. There's no toothpaste, of course, but you do have options. Or rather, you have substances. Welcome to the wonderful world of homemade tooth powder, a medieval buffet of grit, spice, and mild horror. You reach into a little cloth pouch hanging by the hearth. Inside is a powdery mix your grandmother swears keeps teeth as white as a saint's bones. It looks like soot and smells vaguely of fish. That's because the ingredients change depending on who's making it and what's lying around. The core recipe: crushed charcoal, often from burnt bread or bones. Add salt for abrasion, maybe a few dried herbs like rosemary or sage if someone's been raiding the garden. If you're really lucky, or really cursed, someone's added ground up oyster shells or eggshells for that extra calcium crunch. Not exactly enamel safe, but it scrapes the gunk off with the finesse of a cat licking a rasp. And then there's the deluxe version: chalk, pumice, and dried animal bones pounded into powder. It's gritty, it's aggressive, and it tastes like a Viking funeral. You dip your finger into it or roll the end of your chew stick around until it's coated, then start rubbing it into your teeth. The sensation is less clean and more sandpapering your face from the inside. But you do it anyway. Because in your world, bad breath and visible tooth rot aren't just unpleasant, they're social liabilities. And let's face it, nothing kills the mood at a festival like having someone faint mid-sentence from your breath. Some more daring souls dab honey or vinegar into their tooth powders, hoping to mask the taste and maybe kill a few germs in the process. This sometimes works. It also sometimes results in your gums looking like they've been through a minor crusade. One guy in town even tried adding sulfur to his mix. He swore it purified the mouth. He also had 3 teeth and a permanent scorch mark on his tongue. Now, not everyone agrees on what's best. Historians still argue whether these abrasive mixtures actually helped or just eroded enamel until your teeth looked like crumbling masonry. Some say the charcoal drew out toxins. Others argue it just made your breath smell like a campfire with trust issues. Still, there's something almost soothing about the routine. You squat near the hearth, dip your stick, rub your gums with grim determination, and spit into the ashes. It's part hygiene, part ritual, and part wishful thinking. And speaking of wishful thinking, remember that friend who tried using crushed pearls in their tooth powder? Yes, pearls. Apparently, some nobles believed finely ground gemstones could keep your teeth white. They also believed bathing might drain your life force, so it's a mixed bag of logic. For the average person like you, it's not about shine. It's about survival. A cleanish mouth means fewer infections. Fewer infections mean a higher chance of not dying from a gum abscess in your 20s. That's the goal here. Not freshness. Not minty sparkle. Just not dying. And you're not alone. Across the medieval world, versions of these tooth powders exist. In Muslim Spain, scholars like Al-Zarawi wrote about dental hygiene and recommended using mild abrasives, preferably not the medieval equivalent of gravel. In parts of Asia, powdered spices like cloves and cardamom are used both to freshen breath and soothe gums. And in Ethiopia, folks use sutan herbs on twigs that double as toothbrushes and incense sticks. Multifunctional. Mildly terrifying. But back in your cold little cottage, you rinse your mouth with a swig of weak ale, because it's safer than water, and wipe your mouth on your sleeve. Your teeth feel smoother. Your gums tingle. Or maybe that's the salt carving tiny messages into your nerves. Either way, the ritual is done. You're ready to greet the day, confident that your breath might only offend half the village instead of the whole thing. It's the little victories. And hey, at least you're not chewing on a sheep's jawbone anymore. Progress, medieval style. Now that you've exfoliated your teeth with something resembling medieval driveway gravel, it's time to talk about the next step, or maybe misstep, in your dental journey: mouthwash. Don't get excited. This isn't a cool, refreshing mint rinse with a perky label and promises of invigorating flavor. This is the Middle Ages, where hygiene is experimental and often deeply suspicious. Today's rinse involves whatever's on hand. Sometimes that's vinegar. Sometimes it's a solution of herbs steeped in wine. And then there's the worst case scenario: aged human urine. Yes, urine. You heard that right. Let's back up for a second. In the medieval mind, urine wasn't just waste, it was medicine. A diagnostic tool, a stain remover, and, wait for it, a mouthwash. Aged urine, specifically. The kind that's been sitting in a clay pot under your bed for several days, achieving peak ammonia content. Why? Because the ammonia helped cut through grease and grime. You didn't gargle it straight from the source. You let it mature like a fine wine. Or an angry ghost. The practice traces back even further, to ancient Rome and beyond. Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans continued this tradition widely, or if it was more of a fringe habit practiced by those too cheap to buy vinegar. Either way, the fact that it was considered an option tells you everything you need to know about the era's olfactory thresholds. But let's say today's rinse is a bit more palatable, a mix of wine vinegar and sage. You swish it around your mouth, and it burns in a way that feels both cleansing and personally insulting. The vinegar stings any cuts or raw gum spots. The sage gives it a hint of forest floor. You spit it into the fire and hear the satisfying hiss. Clean enough. Of course, there are also more appealing alternatives if you're lucky, or rich. Some use rosewater or myrrh-infused tinctures. A few noble households even imported cinnamon bark or cloves, which you could boil into a spicy mouthwash. It's less about hygiene and more about showing off, like wearing a fur cloak in July. But hey, if your breath smells like spiced honey instead of fermented oats, who's complaining? And if you're feeling very fancy, there's a curious recommendation floating around in medieval texts: rinsing with goat's milk. Apparently, it softens the tongue and sweetens the breath. That's assuming the milk hasn't gone sour in the process. In a world without refrigeration, that's a big assumption. But even these mouthwashes weren't always used to freshen up. Sometimes they were part of medical routines, prescribed by apothecaries who made up for what they lacked in dental degrees with strong opinions and a suspicious number of leeches. A toothache? Gargle with salt water and vinegar. Gums bleeding? Chew fennel seeds, then rinse with wine and chant the Lord's Prayer 3 times. It's medicine meets magic meets culinary improved. And while we're here, let's talk superstition. Because in the medieval world, not all mouthwashes were swallowed or spat. Some were worn. Yes, worn. People believed that tying certain herbs around your neck, or even carrying a bit of dried badger tooth, could prevent dental problems. One particularly desperate tradition involved keeping a dried frog in your mouth for 5 minutes. For what? No one knows. Possibly revenge against your taste buds. But back to your daily rinse. After swishing, you might chew a clove or two if they're available. Not only do they freshen your breath, but they numb your gums, a handy bonus when you're nursing an abscess the size of a walnut. Plus, cloves were associated with wealth and trade. So even if your teeth are falling out, you can at least chew like a spice merchant. You might also try mastic gum, a resin from the mastic tree, chewed throughout the Mediterranean. It's sticky, piney, and rumored to strengthen your gums. Or you gnaw on fennel stems, which double as breath fresheners and, allegedly, aphrodisiacs. Nothing says romantic like swapping clove-laced whispers next to the grain mill. And here's the thing, it all kind of works. Not perfectly, not by modern standards, but enough to keep you functioning in a world where antibiotics don't exist and the nearest dentist is a monk with a spoon. So you spit again. Wipe your mouth on your sleeve. And smile, sort of. There's a hint of vinegar, a suggestion of sage, and the faintest memory of the clove you chewed last feast day. You might not smell like roses, but you're no worse than anyone else on the street. In the Middle Ages, that's a win. Now that your teeth are polished with bone dust and your breath smells faintly of vinegar and tree bark, it's time to confront the inevitable truth: medieval oral care could only go so far. At some point, no matter how diligently you rubbed your teeth with sticks or gargled sage water, nature would come for your molars like a tax collector with a vendetta. So, what happened when things went wrong? Tooth pain in the Middle Ages wasn't just a nuisance, it was a full-body, spirit-crushing event. Your jaw would swell, your gums would throb like war drums, and you'd start making deals with God, saints, and anyone within spitting distance of a hammer. Pain relief options were sparse. And when a tooth needed to come out, the question wasn't if it would hurt, it was how long you'd scream before passing out. Let's start with the local barber. Yes, barber. The man responsible for trimming your beard also doubled as your dentist, surgeon, and, occasionally, your executioner in very bad weeks. His toolkit included razors, forceps, and something called a dental pelican, a lovely iron device designed to wrench teeth from your skull with the grace of a drunken blacksmith. There were no appointments, no soothing background music. You sat on a stool, maybe sipped ale or bit down on a piece of leather, and waited for the inevitable yank. No numbing agents. No anesthesia. Just grit, gravity, and maybe a prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. Her own teeth were pulled out during martyrdom, so naturally she became the go-to for molar-based miracles. But here's where it gets weirder. Some people believed your aching tooth was home to a tooth worm. Yes, an actual worm. This little pest was thought to burrow into your teeth and nibble from the inside, causing pain and decay. The belief wasn't exclusive to medieval Europe, it spanned the globe, from Mesopotamia to Germany, and stuck around until the 18th century. People even thought they could hear the worm squirming if they held a hot iron near their cheek. Spoiler, it was probably just your nerves screaming. To treat the so-called worm, folks would try smoking it out. Literally. They'd place herbs or soot-soaked wool into a hollowed-out tooth and light it, hoping the worm would flee like a tenant facing eviction by flame. Unsurprisingly, this often ended with burns and more pain, and a renewed visit to the barber with the iron claw. Still, desperate times called for desperate remedies. Some suggested stuffing your tooth with garlic. Others, with camphor or cloves soaked in brandy. If your local herbalist was creative, they might mix in mouse fat, honey, and a dash of frog liver. It didn't work, but it certainly gave the infection a taste of variety. And then there were the chants. Oh, the chants. For centuries, people believed you could chant special words or phrases to banish a toothache. One popular charm involved reciting the names of saints backward while spinning in a circle. Another required whispering to a willow tree while tying knots in a strand of horsehair. If your jaw stopped throbbing, was it the magic or just exhaustion? Historians still argue whether medieval folk truly believed these rituals worked or just needed something, anything, to do while their gums smoldered. Meanwhile, more practical solutions came from monastic infirmaries. Monks kept surprisingly detailed records of dental ailments and treatments, ranging from herbal poultices to complex salves made from wine, myrrh, and powdered deer antler. One particularly ambitious remedy involved rubbing roasted onion on your gums, followed by a compress of boiled cabbage leaves. It smelled like betrayal and tasted like regret, but hey, sometimes it helped. When all else failed, the tooth came out. No antiseptic. No tidy gauze pads. Just a lot of yelling and possibly fainting, followed by a day or two of lying very still and hoping the hole in your head didn't get infected. If it did, well, people have died from infected gums. Not often, but enough to make you whisper thanks to the clove you chewed last night. Despite the trauma, people kept seeking help. Some dentists were famous for being fast and brutal. One yank, no second tries, was basically the medieval version of a 5-star Yelp review. Traveling tooth pullers even roamed from town to town, setting up makeshift booths at fairs. They'd wear colorful clothes, bang drums, and pull teeth in front of cheering crowds like some gruesome carnival act. And yes, sometimes they were drunk. And yet, it wasn't all disaster. Some patients survived extractions and lived long lives with surprisingly decent smiles, especially peasants. That's the twist. Peasants, with their rough diets and lack of sugar, often had better teeth than nobles. The upper classes, with their honey cakes and imported figs, were tooth decay's favorite customers. So, while the lord of the manor was getting his molars yanked out one by one, his stable boy might still be grinning with all his originals. That's life in the Middle Ages. One minute you're rubbing your gums with rabbit tallow, the next you're biting a leather strap while a barber swings metal at your face. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't precise. But it was survival, painful, gritty, toothless survival. You've survived the barber's chair, or at least limped away from it with fewer teeth and a much greater appreciation for soup. But losing a tooth isn't the end of your medieval dental adventure. No, now you have to deal with the aftershocks, lingering pain, a permanent gap in your grin, and the ever-present fear that your breath smells like something recently exhumed. Which brings us to one of the few areas where medieval people really tried to fight back, sweetening that dragon breath. Because let's face it, even if your gums are bleeding and your molars are MIA, social survival still matters. You want to talk to your neighbor without them visibly recoiling. You want the market girl to smile at you without covering her nose with her apron. It's the little things. So what do? You turn to herbs, spices, and the medieval equivalents of chewing gum. One of the most common remedies is cloves. You chew them not just for the spicy kick, but because they numb the mouth ever so slightly, like nature's very own anesthetic. They're expensive, though, and imported from far-off lands, which means if you've got cloves in your pouch, you either have money, good trade connections, or a dangerously generous friend. If you're a bit more rustic, you go for parsley. It grows easily, smells green and clean, and chewing it fresh is the medieval version of popping a breath mint. Plus, it doubles as a diuretic and possibly a charm against evil spirits. Triple points for versatility. Mint is another classic. Monks grow it in cloister gardens and hand it out to locals for everything from stomachaches to mouth rot. You might steep it in wine, chew it raw, or crush it into your tooth powder for a moment of herbal glory. Some texts even recommend boiling it with vinegar and using the infusion to rinse your mouth, which works if you ignore the part where it tastes like regret. And then there's fennel. Often chewed after meals, it was praised for its digestive benefits and mouth-freshening properties. One chronicler from the 12th century even claimed it banishes odor from the throat. Medieval marketing at its finest. If you live near the Mediterranean or have connections to someone who's traveled, you might get your hands on mastic gum. This resin from the mastic tree is chewy, slightly bitter, and surprisingly effective at cleaning the teeth and freshening the breath. It's the chewing gum of the ancient world, and in some places, it's still used today. Stick it between your molars and go to town. Just don't expect fruity flavors. For the truly desperate, there are more fragrant solutions. Some suggest chewing on angelica root, which tastes like sweet celery and was believed to purify the breath. Others recommend chewing on dried orange peel if you can get your hands on one. Imported citrus was a rare luxury, but the peels were often saved and dried for exactly this purpose. If your breath smells like oranges, you're basically royalty. And sometimes, it's less about chewing and more about masking. You might rub rosemary on your gums, or keep a little sachet of dried lavender near your neck, hoping it counteracts whatever's happening inside your mouth. It doesn't, really. But it makes you smell like you care, which is almost the same thing. Of course, none of this is perfect. You're still living in a time where tooth decay is common and toothpaste is a fantasy. So you do what you can. You chew your herbs. You avoid talking too close to strangers. You spit discreetly and try not to wince when someone offers you something chewy. And here's the real secret: most people smell a bit like wet hay and goat, so your breath might actually be one of the better scents in the village. It's all relative. But in polite company, or what passes for it, you still make the effort. At a feast, You might see a bowl of fresh herbs passed around at the end of the meal, not for garnish but for chewing. Think of it as a communal breath-freshening station. You grab a sprig of mint, nod to the host, and hope the roasted turnip you just devoured doesn't linger longer than your dignity. And if you're particularly superstitious, there's always the magical root. Some say wearing a tooth amulet made from a wolf's fang or a boar's tusk can ward off decay and bring good fortune. It won't help your breath, but it might keep you from getting punched for it. So you chew, you rinse, you dab a bit of rosemary oil behind your ears if you're feeling extra charming. And then you face the world with your best attempt at a clean mouth and a confident smile, even if it's missing a few key components. Because in the Middle Ages, smelling vaguely like a forest and being only half toothless is the closest thing to a dental win. You're back out in the world now, smiling cautiously, breath a little herbal, teeth a little less whole, and it's time to consider your options if things keep going downhill. Because let's be honest, no amount of clove chewing or mint infusion is going to fix a tooth that's already halfway to Valhalla. So you ask around, quietly. Because admitting your mouth hurts isn't just painful, it's embarrassing. The answer? It's time to visit someone with a little more experience than your neighbor's goat-wrangling cousin. You're going to see the local barber surgeon again. Yes, that same guy who gave you a bowl cut and tried to lance your cousin's boils with a kitchen spoon. He's not just your stylist. He's your one-stop shop for minor surgeries, tooth extractions, and the occasional impromptu bloodletting session. You arrive at his makeshift shop, a wooden chair, a table with questionable stains, and a collection of tools that look more suited to butchering a boar than anything dental. There's a pair of rusted forceps, something resembling pliers, and a jar of what might be coagulated honey or leftover soup. You don't ask. You sit down. He mutters something that sounds like a blessing or a recipe. Then he grips your jaw with one hand and wedges the forceps between your molars. No warning. No countdown. Just talk. You hear a crack, not the satisfying kind, and then a pull that feels like your soul is being tugged out through your jaw. There's a moment of silence, followed by a gush of pain and the unmistakable taste of blood and iron. The barber holds up your tooth like a trophy, tosses it into a bowl of old teeth, and tells you to rinse with ale. Not water, ale. Because it kills the bad spirits. Now here's the medieval kicker, no one thinks this is weird. People in your time accept tooth loss as a rite of passage. Children lose them. Adults lose them. The elderly? Well, they're lucky if they have any left to lose. Toothlessness isn't a sign of bad hygiene. It's just life wearing you down, one molar at a time. But let's say you don't want to walk around with a visible gap. Maybe you're a merchant, or a monk, or just really vain. What can you do? Welcome to the bizarre world of early dentures. Yes, they existed. And yes, they were absolutely terrifying. Some dentures were made from wood. Carved to vaguely resemble human teeth, they were more for appearances than functionality. You might wear them to court, or to a feast, but you wouldn't dare try chewing anything harder than pudding. Imagine biting into a roast duck and leaving half your teeth embedded in the skin. Not a great look. Other sets were made from real teeth, human or animal, collected from the dead or donated by the desperate. There were even traveling salesmen, called tooth hunters, who acquired teeth however they could. Sometimes they were yanked from the recently deceased. Sometimes, not so recently. Again, you don't ask. These teeth would be wired together with gold or silver thread, mounted onto plates of ivory or bone, and jammed into your mouth with all the grace of a brick. They didn't fit well. They didn't stay put. But they gave you the illusion of a full smile, at least until you sneezed. Historians still argue whether these early dentures were ever truly functional or just cosmetic. Some accounts describe people using them successfully for years. Others suggest they caused more infections than they prevented. Either way, if you saw someone with a full set of suspiciously perfect teeth in the 14th century, chances are you were either impressed or immediately suspicious. But maybe you're not that fancy. Maybe your solution is simpler: just keep your mouth shut. Literally. Smile with your lips. Talk without showing your teeth. Laugh behind your hand like you're hiding a secret. This subtle art of concealment becomes part of your daily routine. It's not about shame, it's about dignity. You've lost a tooth, not your manners. Still, some brave souls try to regrow their reputation through charm, wit, and yes, breath mints made from candied herbs or sugared seeds. If you're in a wealthy household, you might even have access to little sugar-coated fennel bits. Tastes great, costs a fortune, and lodges nicely between what teeth you have left. At the end of the day, dental care in the Middle Ages isn't about perfection, it's about pragmatism. Your mouth is a battlefield. Some days you win with parsley and prayer. Other days, you lose a molar and gain a story. And that's the real takeaway here: survival. You might not have perfect enamel or straight incisors, but you've got grit. Literally. It's in your tooth powder. It's in your soul. So your mouth's a bit emptier, your breath's somewhere between vinegar and sage, and your confidence is mostly patched together with clove and denial. But now the ache in your jaw's back, and it's worse. Throbbing. Pulsing. Radiating pain every time you breathe. You begin to suspect it's not just a bad tooth. It might be something far more sinister. Welcome to the world of medieval tooth lore, where cavities weren't just unfortunate, they were spiritual invasions. Forget bacteria. Germ theory won't exist for centuries. In your time, when your tooth hurts, you're not suffering from decay. You're under attack by tooth worms or evil spirits. Yes, worms. Not metaphorical ones. Actual tiny, wriggling creatures that supposedly lived inside your teeth, gnawing at them like squatters in a decaying castle. This idea was staggeringly popular across medieval Europe, Asia, and even parts of Africa. Nobody had microscopes, but people knew something was eating away at their molars. They could feel it. So they imagined worms. Cheeky, pain-loving little invaders. There were even illustrations in medical texts, tiny squiggly things curled inside sliced open teeth. And if the pain disappeared after a chunk of tooth broke off? Clearly, the worm had left. Logical. Horrifying. Very medieval. Treatments for tooth worms varied from oddly creative to deeply alarming. Some healers tried to smoke them out. This meant placing burning herbs like henbane or belladonna near your tooth, hoping the fumes would drive the worm out. A particularly bold method involved hollowing out the bad tooth, filling it with sulfur, then igniting it. Yes, setting fire inside your own mouth. The results? Painful and inconclusive. But hey, you smelled interesting afterward. other remedies leaned into sound. One folk practice involved holding a tuning fork-like instrument next to the jaw and striking it to agitate the worm. Supposedly, it would wriggle in protest. More often, your ear just rang for 3 hours. Some approaches were less aggressive but no less superstitious. Tying a dead toad around your neck, for example. Or burying a fish head under your doorstep. Or sleeping with a clove of garlic under your pillow. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic cures or just desperation manifesting as ritual. If you were lucky enough to live near a monastery or a literate town physician, you might be prescribed a more grounded, though still questionable, treatment. Chewing fennel soaked in wine, for example. Or applying a poultice made from crushed sage, vinegar, and blessed oil. The mixture burned, but not enough to chase the worm out. Still, it gave you something to do between screams. But sometimes, the problem wasn't seen as physical at all. Enter the evil spirits. In medieval Christian thought, especially during high superstition periods, a toothache could be divine punishment. Maybe you lied, or stole, or skipped morning prayers too many times. Whatever the sin, your molar was now the battleground between your soul and some very tooth-focused demon. Naturally, this meant spiritual cures. You'd visit a priest. He'd anoint your jaw with holy oil, mutter a few Latin phrases, maybe tap your cheek with a blessed relic. In extreme cases, you might receive the Eucharist specifically for the tooth's cleansing. If your pain subsided, divine mercy. If not, well, maybe your faith needed work. One of the most popular intercessors was Saint Apollonia. Her story: tortured during Roman persecutions, her teeth were violently shattered before martyrdom. Now she's the patron saint of dental issues. People prayed to her, carried medallions with her image, even wore little silver teeth around their necks as talismans. It wasn't uncommon to find her statue next to candles and clove water in a healer's home. And while we're here, yes, some people believed simply speaking a spell could relieve the pain. One old English charm went something like this: against a worm, take the root of the herb, sing this 3 times, worm, worm, in the wood, flee now from the flesh and blood. You chant it while spitting between your fingers, then press the root to the sore spot. Effective? Debatable? Entertaining? Always. Meanwhile, in Islamic and Jewish communities, similar rituals existed, sometimes invoking angels or sacred words, sometimes involving protective amulets sewn into clothes or hidden near pillows. These weren't just superstitions, they were part of a larger worldview where health and faith were inseparable. So what do you do? Well, your tooth still hurts. The priest says your soul is clean. The barber says he can try pulling the next one. And the village wise woman suggests a smoked weasel skull powder mixed with rose water. You pick your poison, or blessing, and carry on. Because in the Middle Ages, oral pain isn't just a medical issue. It's a curse, a story, a challenge. It's something to be endured, interpreted, spiritualized, and, when all else fails, drank away with the strongest ale in town. After your failed exorcism of the toothworm and that questionable rosewater weasel skull tonic, which, let's be honest, still haunts your breath, you're now considering the divine route. Because when sticks, powders, and barbers can't fix your mouth, there's always one more option: call in a miracle. You make your way to the local church, mouth throbbing in time with your footsteps. Inside, it's cool and shadowy, the air scented with incense and damp stone. You light a candle at the altar of Saint Apollonia. Her icon shows her holding a pair of tongs, because nothing says sainthood like dental torture tools. You whisper a short prayer, asking her to intercede, to take the edge off your pain, or at least to grant you sleep without dreams of jaw snakes. But divine assistance doesn't stop with prayer. There are relics. If you're lucky, or live near a major pilgrimage site, your church might house an actual relic of a saint. A tooth, a bit of jawbone, or even just a cloth that touched the container that once held the jawbone. These items are believed to carry spiritual power. You press your cheek to the reliquary and hope that holiness soaks in faster than the infection. And in some regions, it's not just saints doing the heavy lifting, local healers lean on the divine too. In medieval Scandinavia, for instance, healers carved runes into sticks, whispered protective charms, and invoked both Christian and older pagan names, just to cover all bases. Why risk it? One common practice involved using holy water. Not the gentle sprinkle kind, but full-on swishing. You take a sip, let it rest in the sore spot, and pray. The logic? If the water's good enough to ward off demons, surely it can tackle a swollen gum. Meanwhile, across medieval Islamic culture, dental care and spiritual well-being also intertwined. It was common to recite verses from the Quran during illness, including dental pain. Some traditions recommended specific du'as, prayers said while applying herbal treatments like clove oil or black seed paste. These weren't just medical tools, they were bridges between body and belief. And in Jewish communities, amulets inscribed with protective Hebrew verses were sometimes worn near the jaw, especially for children with teething pain. One medieval text even describes tying a red thread soaked in wine around a child's neck to ease their swollen gums. There's no scientific backing, of course, but it's hard to argue with something your grandmother insists worked for every child since Noah. Still, when the pain becomes unbearable, people get creative. Some folks believe saliva from a holy person, a monk, a healer, or even a reputed wise woman, could cure afflictions. That's right, someone spits in your mouth. Or on your gums. Depending on the level of intimacy and desperation, this could be deeply spiritual or wildly awkward. And there's always the pilgrimage option. Across Europe, pilgrims walked for days, or weeks, to reach shrines famous for healing. Some did it barefoot. Others on their knees. All while suffering from abscesses that made speaking a test of willpower. The hope that standing near a miracle site would chase away the pain. Or at the very least, distract you with blisters. In fact, some shrines kept tooth stones, small rocks believed to have absorbed curative energy. Pilgrims would rub them on their jaws or take a small chip home as a keepsake. One 14th century German diary even mentions a man tying his own tooth to a shrine railing, hoping the pain would stay behind when he left. It didn't. But the tooth did. Despite the mysticism, these rituals weren't entirely about fantasy. They were about control. In a world with no antibiotics and limited knowledge, faith was a comfort, a structure. You couldn't see bacteria, but you could see a candle flicker in a saint's chapel. You couldn't understand nerve pain, but you could memorize a prayer that your mother whispered over you when the nights were too long. And who's to say it didn't help? Plenty of people reported feeling better after a blessing, a relic touch, or a night sleeping under a holy roof. Maybe it was placebo. Maybe it was rest. Or maybe, just maybe, a small miracle met you halfway. So you leave the church with a flicker of hope. The pain hasn't gone, but it's different now. Softer, maybe. You chew a mint leaf, touch the edge of your jaw, and murmur one more thank you to Apollonia. Because in the Middle Ages, healing came not just from herbs or steel, but from faith, ritual, and the belief that even a toothache could be sacred. You've prayed. You've chanted. You've burned enough herbs to fumigate half the village. Still, your tooth mocks you like a little white tombstone in your mouth. So, you take a detour to the fringes. Not to the church, not to the barber, but to someone even more mysterious, the local hedge witch. She lives on the edge of town, of course. Every village has one. Her door is low, her roof is thatched, and she smells like wet moss and lavender. You knock. She opens it before you finish raising your hand. She knows. Your jaw is swollen like a plum. Your eyes are pleading. She doesn't need to ask what's wrong. Let me see, she says, pulling your face into the light. What follows is a mixture of folk magic, herbalism, and culinary guesswork. She starts by smearing something warm and sticky on your cheek. It smells like honey and chicken. She doesn't explain. You don't ask. She mutters under her breath, not quite Latin, not quite gibberish, and starts rummaging through clay pots and bundles of dried plants. First, she gives you something to chew. It's a paste of rosemary, vinegar, and crushed garlic. Your eyes water instantly. Your nose runs. Your soul leaves your body briefly. Good, she says. That means it's working. You're not sure if working means pain relief or expelling your sins through your saliva. Next, she prepares a compress. It's a poultice of mashed turnip, boar fat, and ground sage, wrapped in linen. She ties it around your jaw like a swollen chin strap. You look like someone lost a duel with dinner. But the warmth seeps into your face, dulling the pain just a little. And then the charms begin. She ties a small leather pouch around your neck. Inside, a mix of herbs, fennel, angelica, and a tooth from some unfortunate rodent. It'll draw the pain away, she says. Wear it until the next full moon. You nod solemnly. You're not sure if the pain will be gone by then or if the smell of dead mouse tooth will just override it. Some of these remedies, oddly enough, do have medicinal roots. Garlic and vinegar both have antimicrobial properties. Rosemary can reduce inflammation. Sage has been used for centuries to soothe sore mouths. Historians still argue whether these folk cures were accidental discoveries or the result of generations of trial, error, and superstition. But the witch isn't done. She instructs you to sleep with a dried thyme bundle under your pillow and to spit into the hearth fire before bed. To confuse the worm, she explains. You do it. Not because you believe in worms, but because at this point, you'll do anything. The next morning, your jaw still hurts, but slightly less. Maybe it's the compress. Maybe it's the placebo. Or maybe, as she claimed, the pain has started to listen. You return to thank her. She gives you a vial of thick, dark oil and a warning, only rub this on your gums when the wind comes from the east. You smile politely. you'll probably ignore that part. But you do use the oil. It numbs the pain. It also makes your mouth taste like scorched tree bark, but that's an improvement over blood and despair. She calls it fire root infusion. You don't ask what the root is. Folk medicine wasn't always respected by the learned, of course. Monks and physicians often dismissed these healers as charlatans, or worse, witches. Yet many common people relied on them daily. Because the barber would pull your tooth, the monk would pray over it. But the hedge witch, she tried to heal it. And she wasn't alone. Across medieval Europe, women, and some men, passed down these remedies by word of mouth. Kitchen wisdom, garden lore, and the occasional moon phase ritual were part of life. In Italy, it was common to pack infected teeth with cheese mold. In France, a poultice of hot mustard and vinegar. In Iceland, chewing dried fish skin was a popular remedy. Questionable, but committed. Not all of it worked. Some was pure nonsense. But some, well, let's just say the line between magic and early pharmacology is blurrier than a monk after too much wine. And while scholars debated Galen and Hippocrates, your local herbwoman just wanted your jaw to stop throbbing. You respect that. So you keep wearing the mouse tooth amulet. Maybe it helps. Maybe it scares off suitors. Either way, your jaw isn't as angry. You breathe easier. You smile, even if it's crooked. Because in the medieval world, you don't need to be fully cured. You just need to be functioning enough to feed the chickens and not scream every time you drink cold ale. And if that requires boar fat and whispered spells, so be it. The witch's compress worked, or at least did something, and your mouth has downgraded from a war zone to a minor skirmish. But you've heard whispers of another solution, quieter and less messy than mouse teeth and mustard poultices, herbs from the monastery. You trudge your way to the nearest abbey, a place where stone walls breathe cool shadows and the silence is broken only by chants and the occasional sheep bleating in theological protest. Monks, with their flowing robes and suspiciously clean hands, aren't just guardians of scripture, they're also some of the best informal dentists in medieval Europe. See, monasteries grow herbs. Lots of herbs. Rows of mint, sage, chamomile, and rue, plants that heal, soothe, and sometimes knock you out long enough to forget about your molars. In a world before universities had proper medical faculties, these gardens are botanical libraries of folk wisdom and clerical science. Brother Thomas greets you. He's quiet, middle-aged, and smells faintly of lavender and beeswax. He doesn't ask many questions, just peers into your mouth with a candle and a frown that says, "You've let the devil camp out in your gums." You brace for judgment. Instead, he leads you to the herb garden. He points out plants as you walk, mint for freshening breath, sage for sore gums, rosemary for inflammation, and thyme, which he swears calms both mouth and mind. You wonder if that's a theological metaphor. He doesn't explain. Back in his tiny workroom, part library, part apothecary, he prepares a rinse. It's a decoction of mint, sage, vinegar, and a bit of honey. You swish. You gargle. You try not to choke on the floating bits of green. And miraculously, your mouth feels a little better. Don't spit it out immediately, Brother Thomas warns. Let it speak to the pain. You nod solemnly. Pain speaking is not in your usual dental vocabulary, but you're learning. Then he gives you a chewing mix wrapped in linen. Dried rosemary, fennel seeds, and a hint of licorice root. You chew slowly as he mutters a blessing. It tastes like a spice market collided with a broom closet, but it distracts you from the pulsing in your jaw. Here's the thing, monks in the Middle Ages aren't just holy men, they're record keepers. They write down recipes, remedies, and treatments passed from healer to healer. Some of these texts, like the Herbarium or the Leech Book of Bald, are collections of everything from practical salves to wildly optimistic elixirs. Place mashed leeks and wine in the ear to cure toothache, one suggests. You choose to file that one under last resorts. Historians still argue whether monastic medicine was advanced or just less dangerous than other medieval options. But the monks did one thing very well, they paid attention. They tracked what worked. They watched what herbs healed wounds or eased fevers. And in the quiet halls of their cloisters, they refined their cures slowly and methodically, without the drama of barber surgeons or the flair of folk healers. And they didn't always think illness was sin. Sure, some monks blamed dental pain on excessive meat or impure thoughts. But others just saw it as part of the body's cycle, something to be soothed, not punished. A refreshingly modern idea for people who also believed bloodletting could cure a stubbed toe. As you sit in the garden sipping monk-brewed herbal wine, you listen to bees humming lazily over the mint blossoms. You realize something odd, you feel almost normal. Not cured, but not cursed either. Just a human with a slightly cleaner mouth, wrapped in the quiet wisdom of people who've seen hundreds of mouths and thousands of aches. Before you leave, Brother Thomas hands you a tiny scroll of parchment. A recipe, he says. For if the pain returns. You open it later. It reads, for pain of the teeth, boil sage, vinegar, and salt. Let cool. Swish 3 times before sunrise. If pain persists, offer a prayer and repeat with stronger wine. You smile. Not because it's funny, but because it's the closest thing to a treatment plan you've had in weeks. And as you walk home, mouth tingling faintly from thyme and honey, you think maybe, just maybe, survival doesn't have to mean suffering. Not entirely. Not when there's mint growing behind monastery walls and a monk willing to whisper peace into your jaw. Feeling marginally more human thanks to Brother Thomas's herbal cocktail, you wander through the village with a slightly less cursed mouth. But as the sun sets and the wind carries the aromas of evening stew and livestock, another truth drifts into your awareness: everyone else smells just as medieval as you do. Welcome to the realm of royal halitosis. Because even in the gilded corridors of castles, bad breath was a reality no crown could escape. You'd think kings and queens had special access to dental miracles, but no. Monarchs had the same mouths as peasants, just with more sugar and fewer excuses. At court, appearances mattered. And so did breath. Imagine whispering sweet nothings in a great hall echoing with the scent of garlic pottage and 3-day-old wine. Not ideal. So, nobles had their own arsenal of remedies, fancier, pricier, and sometimes downright ridiculous. Take, for example, clove-studded oranges. These weren't for eating. They were held delicately in silk handkerchiefs, lifted occasionally to the face, and sniffed deeply to cleanse the palate before conversation. It didn't cure halitosis, but it distracted from it, like spraying perfume in a barn. Some nobles chewed cardamom, imported at eye-watering cost from distant lands. It left a spicy aftertaste and was thought to excite the humors, which in medieval medicine meant anything from digestion to amorous intent. If you had cardamom on your breath, you were either wealthy or trying to impress someone. Meanwhile, powdered cinnamon, cloves, and anise were sprinkled on wine or mashed into soft balls of honey and sucked slowly at courtly feasts. Not exactly tic-tacs, but close enough in function. These were called comfits, and nobles carried them in ornate silver boxes, slipping one discreetly after every roast boar and public speech. For the especially self-conscious, breath-freshening pastes were applied to the tongue with a small brush or finger. Ingredients included crushed pearls, sugar, mint, and, in one recipe, powdered coral. Because what's better for a sensitive tongue than ground ocean rocks? And let's not forget the most outrageous trend of all, breath masks. No, not cloth masks like we use today. These were tiny sachets of herbs and fragrant powders tied around the neck or tucked inside clothing. Some even clipped to the nose. You wore them like medieval Febreze, ensuring your conversation partner got a whiff of lavender and not lamb stew decay. Still, no amount of clove and coral could cover everything. The diet of nobles didn't help. While peasants gnawed on barley bread and vegetables, nobles indulged in rich meats, sauces heavy with garlic and onion, and endless sweetened wines. More sugar meant more cavities. More meat meant slower digestion. And all of it lingered on the breath like an unwelcome bard. Interestingly, it's the peasants who often had the better breath. Their diets, though bland, were cleaner. No imported sweets. Less alcohol. More fiber. They also chewed more herbs, out of necessity, not fashion. So while they didn't carry clove boxes, they might not need them. Historians still debate whether nobles knew their breath was offensive. Some say they absolutely did. Etiquette books from the time advise people to speak not too close to another's face, lest your breath offends. Others argue that everyone was so used to the communal funk of daily life that breath was just one of many background smells. Even romantic customs took bad breath into account. In some regions, couples chewed fennel or rosemary before kissing, a gesture both thoughtful and practical. In others, breath was part of the allure, raw, earthy, honest. Clearly written by someone who had never smelled boiled eel stew on a hot afternoon. Of course, not everyone could afford the luxury of masking their breath. Servants, soldiers, and travelers made do with whatever grew nearby. Pine needles, juniper berries, and bits of resin scraped from tree bark were all chewed for freshness and flavor. If it was bitter and astringent, it made the cut. Still, the effort to mask bad breath wasn't just vanity. It was diplomacy. In a world where alliances were made through whispered deals and strategic marriages, no one wanted their mouth to be the reason a treaty failed. So tonight, you return home with a deeper appreciation for the humble mint leaf. You chew one slowly, picturing a king somewhere doing the same, albeit from a gilded bowl held by an underpaid servant. Because whether you're a stable boy or a monarch, your breath is your introduction. And in the Middle Ages, that introduction could mean the difference between marriage, mockery, or mild exile. Tonight, as you sit by the fire nibbling on a crust of barley bread and savoring the aftertaste of mint and vinegar, your thoughts drift to something almost too modern to believe: prevention. It sounds laughable in an age where plagues are seasonal and dental tools double as torture devices, but even in the Middle Ages, some people dared to ask, what if we stopped the rot before it started? It begins with diet. See, you may not have toothpaste or floss, but you do have hard bread, and that's more useful than it sounds. Daily meals often include coarse, dense loaves of bread that double as edible scrub brushes. The rough texture helps scrape debris from your teeth. Call it pre-industrial dental exfoliation. Your meals are naturally low in sugar, unless you're wealthy. That means fewer sugary enemies for your teeth to battle. No sodas. No sticky candies. Just vegetables, grains, and the occasional piece of meat so tough it could qualify as armor. Chewing it forces your jaw into a medieval workout, and while it doesn't do much for your breath, it keeps your mouth active and flushed with saliva, the body's first line of defense. And there's another hidden hero, your saliva. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the role of saliva in cleaning the mouth, but they did recognize its power. Saliva was described in medical texts as a gentle humoral cleanser. Not terribly scientific, but not wrong either. They just didn't know it was full of enzymes that break down food particles and fight bacteria. They just knew that chewing herbs or tough bread made their mouths feel better. You've also been told to rinse with water after meals, assuming there's clean water to be had. It's not always available, but when it is, rinsing becomes a post-meal ritual, like picking your teeth with a sliver of bone or a frayed twig. You swish, you spit, and you feel oddly modern. Speaking of picking your teeth, toothpicks were common and surprisingly well crafted. Some were made of silver or gold for the wealthy, others of wood or bone. You might carry one in your belt pouch, right next to your eating knife. After a meal, you duck into a corner or lean over a trough and dig out the remnants of roasted turnip or barley gruel, with the satisfaction of someone reclaiming real estate. Toothpicks weren't just tools, they were fashion statements. Nobles would sometimes chew on ornate picks during conversation, the way someone today might idly twirl a pen. It was equal parts hygiene and social posturing. Look at me, I care about my dental decorum. Then there's the use of twigs, which you already know well. But you might not know that people were choosy about which trees they used. Willow, hazel, and applewood were popular not just for their texture, but their supposed healing properties. In parts of the Islamic world, the miswak twig was praised for its antimicrobial benefits. Even in Europe, healers began recommending specific twigs for specific ailments: chew hazel for strong teeth, oak for bleeding gums. It's not scientific, but it's something. And more often than not, it worked better than you'd expect. Even bathhouses, where available, played a small role. Though not focused on oral hygiene, they encouraged cleanliness in general. After soaking in a warm communal tub and scrubbing off layers of grime, you might take a moment to rinse your mouth or chew a clove to prepare for conversation. Hygiene, even partial, was contagious. In wealthier households, dental care was part of grooming. Servants would prepare bowls of warm water, scented with herbs, for morning and evening rinses. A noble might have a special cloth for wiping the teeth, or even a small, personal tooth scraper, a tool made of silver, curved just so, for maintaining appearances at court. And among the most educated, you find a few surprising recommendations. Some early medical texts advised against eating too soon after brushing with powders. Others suggested chewing licorice root for both its flavor and its supposed strengthening effect on teeth and gums. Occasionally, someone would suggest massaging the gums with wool soaked in vinegar and honey, which sounds bizarre until you realize it's not that different from modern mouthwashes, just itchier. It's not that people didn't care. They did. They just lacked the science. They knew that some foods made their mouths feel cleaner. They knew that rough braid and chewing herbs helped more than they hurt. They knew that neglect led to pain, and that prevention, even clumsy, was better than crisis. So tonight, after you chew your licorice root and rinse with herb-steeped water, you lie down knowing you've done what your ancestors have done for centuries, tried. Try to keep your teeth, your breath, your dignity intact. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because in the Middle Ages, survival didn't just mean making it through war and famine. It meant chewing, laughing, and kissing without wincing. You're up with the rooster again, jaw sore but functional, mouth tasting of the strange marriage between rosemary and toasted barley. It's a new day, and today's drama doesn't come from aching teeth or weird poultices. Today, you're headed to the fair. And that means one thing, tooth pullers. Fairs in the medieval world are loud, chaotic, and glorious. They're a mix of commerce, performance, food, and the occasional petty theft. You wander past stalls selling onions, dyed cloth, and small birds in handmade cages. The smells are intoxicating, sweetmeats sizzling, animal sweat steaming, and somewhere, someone has definitely dropped a wheel of cheese. But then you hear it, a clanging bell, a man's booming voice, and a small crowd forming near a makeshift stage. It's the tooth puller. He's wearing a red tunic, half stained with who knows what, and a jaunty feather in his cap like this is a party, not oral surgery. His table is laid out like a magician's act, shiny metal tools, a tankard of ale, a cloth stained with the memories of previous patients, and, most charmingly, a string of actual human teeth he wears like a necklace. Festive. He shouts to the crowd, promising instant relief, no pain, and teeth so clean angels would weep to see them. You know it's a lie. Everyone knows. But still, people line up. Because when your molar feels like it's trying to escape through your eye socket, you don't care if the man wielding the forceps is sober. You care that he can pull. One poor soul climbs into the chair. The tooth puller holds up the instrument, an iron thing shaped like a question mark and a meat hook's mean cousin. He doesn't wait. He jabs, twists, yanks. The patient lets out a noise that probably echoes through the wheat fields. The crowd cheers. Someone faints. The tooth lands in a bucket. Then the man hands over a rag soaked in wine and motions for the next in line. You inch forward. Not because you need a pull, but because this is theatre. A grim, noisy, very medieval form of entertainment. Some folks treat tooth pulling like a public execution or a bear dance. There's horror. There's awe. There's also a weird sense of relief. Because if you're not the one screaming, you're winning. These traveling tooth pullers are more showmen than surgeons. Some are semi-skilled. Many are not. They learn by doing, or by watching their fathers do it, and their tools aren't always cleaned between customers. Historians still argue whether these men caused more infections than they cured. But one thing's for sure, they were accessible, and they were fast. And speed counts. In an age without anesthesia, slow is torture. A skilled puller could get a tooth out in seconds. A bad one? You might leave with fewer teeth than intended, or a permanently misshapen jaw. Some of them try to distract you, a slap on the back, a joke, a swig of something strong. One even claimed to hypnotize patients with the sound of a drum. Another let his assistant perform crude puppet shows during the extraction. Whatever worked to make you sit still. And they didn't just pull teeth. They sold powders too. Cure-all mixtures of chalk, ash, ground rosemary, and sometimes powdered brick. Yes, brick. You'd mix it with wine or water and rub it on your gums. Did it help? Only if you consider distraction by mouth fire helpful. But not everyone was fooled. Local wise women, monks, and even a few brave physicians often warned against these flashy fares. They called the pullers fang thieves and mouth butchers. Some towns even banned them from setting up shop near churches or markets after too many complaints or infections. Still, desperate people keep lining up. Because where else can you get a tooth pulled for half a chicken and a prayer? Eventually, the tooth puller notices you watching. You next, he grins, revealing a set of teeth suspiciously perfect for a man in his line of work. You shake your head. Suit yourself, he says, turning back to the crowd. But don't wait too long. Teeth are like debts. Ignore them and they get angry. You chuckle. He's not wrong. You walk away, mouth intact, soul slightly disturbed, but weirdly entertained. Because this is the medieval world. Tooth care is part spectacle, part gamble, and part raw courage. And today, you chose observation over extraction. A victory, however small. The fair fades behind you, its shouts and music dissolving into the late afternoon hush. Your jaw still tingles from the distant memory of pain, and from that mildly suspicious herbal clump Brother Thomas gave you for resilience. But as the breeze cools and the village quiets, another truth creeps into your mind: what happens when you get old? Because eventually, teeth give up. You know this. You've seen it. Your grandmother gums her stew with admirable tenacity. The village baker talks without moving his mouth, like he's hiding a secret or a squirrel. And there's old Joran, who claims he hasn't chewed in a decade and survives purely on broth, boiled root vegetables, and sheer spite. Toothlessness is a kind of milestone in the Middle Ages, not just physical, but social. It signals age, wisdom, and, unfortunately, vulnerability. If you're lucky, your transition into gummy nobility is gradual. A tooth falls here. Another wobbles loose there. You learn to chew with your side molars. You cut your bread into smaller pieces. You soak it in broth like a person determined to enjoy life one mushy bite at a time. But if you're not lucky, if your teeth decide to mutiny all at once, you might wake up one day to find your mouth a battlefield of holes, abscesses, and aching gums. You'll talk less. Smile less. You'll avoid crunchy foods with a war veteran's caution. And yet, you'll adapt. Because medieval people are surprisingly resilient. And the community, oddly, understands. No one shames the toothless. They expect it. They just hand you the softer part of the pottage and move on. Still, some elders refuse to surrender to the soup life. There are accounts, rare but real, of makeshift dental appliances. Crude dentures made from wood, bone, or even the teeth of the deceased. Wealthy nobles sometimes commission artisans to carve entire sets of replacement teeth, mounted on ivory plates or stitched into linen bands that tie around the back of the head. It's not functional, but it looks okay-ish. One French noblewoman, legend says, wore an elaborate jawpiece made of horse teeth and velvet straps. Another account from a German abbey describes a monk with a mouthpiece lined with carved boxwood. He called it "my chewing prayer." The nickname didn't stick, but the ingenuity did. Historians still argue whether these devices were daily tools or ceremonial masks for public appearances. Either way, they speak to a fundamental medieval truth: people cared about how they looked, even when they couldn't chew. And where function failed, fashion stepped in. Toothless elders sometimes wore veils or scarves to cover their mouths. It wasn't shame, it was style. A practical, elegant way to hide a sunken jaw or a drooping lip. In some regions, it became part of elder fashion. A subtle nod to age and modesty, like a grey streak or a favorite walking stick. Plus, many medieval artworks depict elders with serene, closed-mouth expressions. No beaming grins. Just wise, lined faces and the quiet dignity of someone who survived at least 3 outbreaks of dysentery. In those paintings, the absence of teeth isn't hidden. It's irrelevant. But not all responses were graceful. Some elders grew reclusive, tired of the struggle to speak or eat or laugh. They retreated into quieter routines, early dinners, warm gruel, silent prayers. And then there were the loud ones. The storytellers who leaned into their toothlessness like a badge of honor, making wild clicking noises and terrifying children with gummy grins. You suspect you'll be one of those. Because even as the teeth go, the humor remains. You joke with neighbors about the second childhood, soft food, naps, and being told what to eat. You compare missing molars like war wounds. Left side, second from the back, you nod gravely. Lost it during the rye harvest. And despite everything, you eat. You mash apples with your tongue. You drink thick soups with chunks softened to oblivion. You grind cooked lentils into paste and pretend it's pâté. You adapt because you have to. Because survival isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance. And you're not alone. Children help by chewing tough food first. Spouses cut your meat. Friends offer herbs to numb the ache. In the end, the village supports its toothless members, not out of pity, but out of practicality. Today it's your mouth. Tomorrow it's theirs. So tonight, you sit by the fire, spooning warm root stew into your mouth. You chew slowly, thoughtfully, with whatever teeth remain. A bit of molar, a defiant canine, maybe a ghost of an incisor. It's not ideal, but it works. And in the flickering glow, as you listen to the wind hum through the thatch, you realize something else. Toothlessness isn't the end of your story. It's just a softer chapter. Morning fog wraps around the village like a wool cloak, and your joints remind you, gently but persistently, that age is real. You shift in your seat, suck thoughtfully on a bit of clove root, and start wondering about something you've heard murmured during feast days and whispered in low tavern corners. Were there doctors for teeth? Not barbers or monks, but actual professionals? As it turns out, sort of. In the Middle Ages, the concept of a dentist as we know it didn't exist. But there were people, semi-specialists, who began to blur the line between enthusiastic amateur and actual oral expert. They were known by different names: tooth drawers, dental surgeons, and, in rare cases, physicians with a particular interest in the mouth. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it's a start. These early dental dabblers mostly emerged in urban centers, places like Paris, Bologna, and later, London, where trade and population density created a pressing need for organized health care. When your town has 10,000 mouths and one barber with the shakes, you start looking for alternatives. Some medical schools began to dabble in mouth-related lectures. Not full courses, no one was earning degrees in gum care, but notes were taken, diagrams drawn, and tools refined. In Bologna, for instance, medical students studied the head and neck as part of general anatomy. Some of those students went on to become surgeons, and some surgeons, perhaps the boldest among them, volunteered to pull infected teeth. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These dental professionals still operated in a pre-microscope world. They didn't understand bacteria. They had no concept of sterilization. But they were organized. They recorded symptoms. They categorized tooth types. One 14th century physician even attempted a classification of dental pain ranging from nagging buzz to the devil's harp. And slowly, a culture of semi-specialization began to form. Wealthy townspeople might call upon a certain master of teeth when all other remedies failed. These men carried better tools, finely crafted forceps, files, and even drills. Yes, drills. Tiny, hand-cranked, and terrifying. Used mostly to remove decay or drain abscesses. You did not want to sneeze mid-procedure. One of the more infamous characters in this world was John of Arderne, an English surgeon who dabbled in all sorts of body horrors but included several entries on dental abscesses in his texts. His solution? Lancing the gum with a heated iron and praying the swelling didn't turn septic. Bold. Brutal. Slightly better than letting it fester. Meanwhile, in parts of the Islamic world, scholars were a step ahead. Physicians like al-Zarawi, also known as Abulcasis, wrote detailed treatises on oral health. He described tools, techniques, and even surgical approaches for treating diseased gums and extracting teeth. His work was translated into Latin and circulated widely, influencing European practice, even if most practitioners only understood half of what he meant. Historians still argue whether these early dental references were practical or just theoretical. After all, writing "extract gently" doesn't mean your patient won't leave with a broken jaw. But even theory mattered. It showed that some people were thinking critically about oral health, not just reacting, but planning. And then there were the guilds. As trade grew, so did regulation. Certain towns began requiring barber surgeons to register with local authorities. Some even had to pass rudimentary exams. If you wanted to legally extract teeth in certain parts of 15th century France, for example, you had to demonstrate competence with the pliers and provide testimony from past victims, patients. It wasn't standardized. It wasn't consistent. But it was something. You hear whispers of a man in Ghent who's removed over 500 teeth and claims to replace them with carved ivory replicas. In Florence, a woman renowned for her gentler techniques uses rose oil and whispered prayers. These early professionals aren't common, but they exist, hidden in the folds of history like forgotten tools in a dusty leather pouch. And if you're really fortunate, you might live near a noble household wealthy enough to retain a personal tooth drawer. These individuals, often apprenticed from youth, develop a skill set far beyond the average fairground puller. They know how to drain a gum boil without hitting the bone. They understand which herbs to apply afterward. They even get this, sometimes clean teeth. Tooth cleaning as a service? Inconceivable. And yet, here and there, a whisper of modern dentistry echoes through the medieval fog. Rudimentary. Painful. Wrapped in cloth and candle smoke. But unmistakably present. So, you sit back, chew your clove root, and consider your options. You may not have a dental clinic, but you have something rarer, choice. Between the monk, the barber, the herbalist, and now, maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a professional. It's a small comfort. But in the Middle Ages, small comforts are golden. The sun hangs low, casting amber light over the village rooftops, and your thoughts settle on something more communal, because while your aching gums are yours alone, oral care in the Middle Ages is not just a personal journey. It's a shared experience. Like firewood gathering, market gossip, or wondering out loud whether that twitchy goat is possessed. In fact, you begin to notice how often teeth come up in daily life. And not just in complaints or winces, but in rituals, customs, and even social codes. Dental health, or the lack thereof, weaves quietly through the medieval tapestry like a loose thread made of bone and breath. Take, for instance, the curious ritual surrounding a baby's first tooth. In most villages, this milestone is cause for celebration and slight panic. Why panic? Because superstitions are thick around infant health, and a baby's first tooth is believed to be both a blessing and an omen. If the tooth appears on the upper gum first, some say it foretells bad luck. Lower? Good fortune. No one can explain why, but midwives will nod solemnly and wrap the child in an extra prayer anyway. Parents might offer symbolic gifts to the child, a sprig of rosemary for protection, a small silver charm if they're wealthy, or, oddly, a tiny pastry shaped like a tooth. Don't eat it. It's purely decorative and weirdly crusty. Children themselves have tooth customs, too. In parts of Europe, when a child loses a baby tooth, it's tossed onto the roof. Why? So the sun or moon, depending on your local law, can see it and bless the child with strong adult teeth. Other customs involve burying the tooth in the garden or feeding it to a domestic animal, usually a pig or a chicken. Give your pain to something that can chew it, as the saying goes. And then there are the games. Children play Tooth Night, where one child pretends to lose a tooth in battle, and the others heal them using dandelions and dirt. It's gloriously inaccurate and wildly unsanitary, but it's play. And play is how kids learn to fear and respect what's inside their mouths. Adults, too, incorporate dental health into social rituals. At feasts, it's polite to chew slowly and cover your mouth when speaking, partly to show respect, partly to hide the cabbage stuck between your bicuspids. After meals, especially in noble settings, bowls of water are passed for rinsing. Sometimes scented. Always shared. You slosh, you spit, you nod like you've done something dignified. Even marriages have dental considerations. Prospective brides and grooms are assessed, quietly, by their smiles. Not just for beauty, but for practicality. Can they chew? Can they teach children to chew? Do they look like someone whose mouth won't rot into ruin by 30? Harsh, yes, but this is the Middle Ages. Romance has to share a room with reality. One fringe tradition, mostly from Eastern Europe, involves checking a bride's molars as part of the betrothal process. A matchmaker inspects her teeth for signs of decay or crowding. It's less about love and more about future soup budgets. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or just one weird town with too many dental issues and too few eligible bachelors. And then there's funerary customs. When someone dies, the condition of their teeth sometimes plays a role in burial rituals. In certain regions, a person with missing or blackened teeth might be buried with a clove in their mouth to sweeten their final breath for the afterlife. Others are buried with a sprig of mint or a toothpick made from apple wood, just in case heaven expects fresh breath at the gate. Skulls, when uncovered years later during church renovations or grave rediggings, are occasionally examined for mouth omens. A clean jaw suggests a righteous life. A jaw riddled with gaps and rot? Maybe not so righteous. Or just poor dental luck. Either way, someone probably makes a note in the parish records. And let's not forget the traveling entertainers, the troubadours and storytellers who weave tales of knights and dragons and occasionally really bad breath. Tooth jokes are common in their routines. A knight whose halitosis defeats enemies before his sword can. A princess who demands her suitor chew rosemary before proposing. The people laugh, not just because it's funny, but because it's true. You realize that even in a world without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dental clinics, teeth are never far from the medieval mind. They show up in art, grimacing saints, snarling demons. They show up in dreams. Losing teeth often symbolizes change or divine punishment. And they show up in every conversation that ends with, "My jaw hasn't felt right since the harvest." Tonight, as you share a pot of soft porridge with your neighbor and trade stories about whose molars are loosening this month, you feel a strange kinship. You're not alone. Not in your pain. Not in your rituals. Not in your quiet, clove-scented war against the inevitable. Because here, in the heart of the Middle Ages, a good laugh and a half-toothless smile are sometimes the best medicine. The moon creeps higher, slipping between thatch rooftops and chimney smoke, and as the fire crackles in your hearth, you think of something darker. Not your own jaw, although it's still throwing out the occasional ache like an overzealous town crier, but the superstitions that swirl around teeth in the shadowy corners of medieval belief. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages are good at, it's turning biology into mysticism. Let's start with the most persistent myth, the tooth worm. Yes, we've brushed up against it before, but it's worth lingering here. For centuries, people across Europe and Asia believed that tiny worms lived in the teeth of those suffering from decay or pain. These worms were thought to gnaw relentlessly from the inside, causing that dreaded throb that wakes you up at night or ruins your turnip soup. The theory was so widespread that medical texts, from Arabic treatises to German folk manuals, included detailed instructions for smoking out these invisible intruders. Henbane was a favorite. Its pungent smoke supposedly chased the worms out, although it more likely just numbed your gums and made you mildly hallucinate. You'd swear you saw a worm crawl out of your molar. In reality, probably just a bit of burnt clove or your sanity unraveling. But worms weren't the only myth to make mouths the battleground of the supernatural. There's the belief that losing a tooth without proper ritual could open your soul to possession. It sounds dramatic, but imagine the logic. Your body is a sacred vessel. Every part matters. If a tooth falls out and isn't properly buried, burned, or fed to a passing bird, yes, that was a thing, then a spirit might sneak in through the gap. In some Slavic regions, people tied fallen teeth to the tails of cats and sent them running into the woods. Carry it far, they'd say. so the devil can't find the way back to my mouth. A noble effort, though the cats probably had questions. Other myths are tied to omens. Bleeding gums, for example, were sometimes seen as a sign of bad luck or impending death. If your gums bled during a new moon, it was said a relative would fall ill. If they bled during a solar eclipse, someone in your village was already cursed, and you'd better find out who before your jaw falls off. Some towns kept records of these signs, adding dental pain to lists of portents alongside comets and two-headed calves. A particularly grim 13th century diary from northern Italy recounts a week where 3 women experienced tooth boiling, possibly abscesses, followed by the death of their local bishop. Coincidence? Probably. But try telling that to people who believe their mouths are mood rings for the supernatural. Even dreams about teeth carried weight. Lose a tooth in a dream? Expect betrayal. Pull one out yourself? You'll soon be rid of a burden. Find someone else's tooth in your pocket? That's a death omen so strong, you'd better start confessing your sins just in case. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were regional curiosities or deeply woven into everyday medieval psychology. Some say they were merely metaphors, like most folk superstitions. Others believe they genuinely influenced behavior, from who people trusted to when they scheduled tooth extractions, never during Mercury retrograde, apparently. But not all tooth-related myths were bleak. Some offered protection. In parts of France and England, carrying a baby's first lost tooth was considered lucky. Midwives might sew it into a pouch and tie it to the child's clothing to guard against sickness. In Germany, a soldier going to war might keep a dried molar in his boot for courage. It was believed the strength of your bite carried into battle. And of course, there were love charms. Yes, dental romance. In a few particularly bold traditions, lovers would exchange a tooth as a token of devotion. Not a whole one, mind you. Just a fragment. A tiny shard worn on a cord around the neck, nestled in a locket, or, disturbingly, ground into powder and mixed into a love potion. You sip the wine. You don't ask about the sediment. Tonight, as you cradle your jaw and listen to the owls hooting above, you think about these myths, not with fear, but with strange affection. They're absurd, sure. But they're also deeply human. They speak to the fear of pain, the mystery of the body, the desperate need to explain suffering. Because in a world without science, every ache was a message. And sometimes, the message was, get a cat, feed it your tooth, and hope for the best. The next morning arrives with a gift, a sharp jab beneath your molar, like your jaw's way of saying, good morning. I hate you. You press your fingers to your cheek and groan softly, then remember what day it is. Market day. Not just for onions and oatcakes, but for information, the kind passed in whispers over spice stalls and near barrels of questionable fish. You wrap your shawl, pop a fennel seed between your teeth, and head into the fray. Because today, you're going hunting for a rare treasure, an actual tooth cleaning tool. The market is already in motion by the time you arrive. You dodge a goat wearing half a tunic, sidestep a haggler waving pickled eels, and finally find the cart you're looking for, Master Elric's Wares of the Curious and Useful. Elric is a traveling merchant with eyebrows like startled crows and a voice that cracks like old leather. His table is a museum of chaos, spoons shaped like fish, velvet gloves with 3 fingers, bottles promising everything from eternal youth to better burping. But in the middle of it all, there they are, tooth cleaning twigs. He calls them chew sticks, which sounds quaint but is actually rather accurate. Small branches from particular trees, willow, apple, hazel, peeled slightly at one end to reveal fibrous strands. You bite. You chew. You scrub. It's like floss, a toothbrush, and a stress toy all in one. You pick the applewood one. It smells fresh, slightly sweet, and tastes less awful than expected. You rub it along your teeth and feel a kind of primitive satisfaction. Tiny bits of yesterday's bread give way. Your tongue reports back, smoother, cleaner. These twigs, it turns out, are more than peasant ingenuity. In various parts of the world, especially the Islamic regions, similar tools have been used for centuries. The miswak, made from the arak tree, was known for its cleansing properties and even praised in religious texts. Its popularity stretches from Egypt to Persia and beyond, and for good reason, it works. Elric doesn't know any of this. He just says, imported from a monk's garden and blessed by chicken. You nod solemnly and hand over a copper coin. Next to the chew sticks are tiny cloth bundles, herbal powders meant to be rubbed directly onto your gums and teeth. You sniff one. It smells like mint, with a hint of charcoal and something metallic. Iron filings, Elric says cheerfully. For strengthening the enamel. You raise an eyebrow. Or was it tin, he adds. You quietly move on. Still, these powders have their roots in something real. Early dental powders often included sage, salt, and sometimes crushed seashells. They were abrasive, yes, but they got the job done, scraping away plaque and food residue. Some even included dried rosemary or mint for freshness. Others had powdered myrrh, which had mild antiseptic properties and made your mouth smell like a very holy apothecary. You pick a sachet labeled, "For breath most noble," and decide not to ask what's inside. Later that afternoon, after the crowds disperse and the goat tries, again, to eat someone's hem, you sit by the village well with your new tools. The chew stick is soft now, flexible at the end like a broom made of twine. You run it along your gums, gently but thoroughly. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't taste amazing. But it feels right. Like you're doing something useful. Children gather, curious. One dares to ask if you're eating a twig for lunch. You explain, then offer a spare. They laugh, chew, gag slightly, then keep going. A few adults join, quietly intrigued. You share what you know, which isn't much, but it's more than nothing. And that's how it spreads. In a world without dental schools, the best tools are passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, whispered from travelers and traders and wandering monks. No advertisements. No packaging. Just word of mouth, quite literally. By evening, you've cleaned your teeth as well as any medieval person can. You rinse with mint water, chew a few fennel seeds, and stare at your reflection in a tarnished piece of polished metal. You smile. Not bad. Because sometimes, survival isn't about curing the pain. It's about learning the rituals, adopting the habits, and embracing the small victories, a smooth molar, a twig in your pouch, and the knowledge that at least one of your teeth might stick around a little longer. Evening settles once again, this time thick with fog and the faint scent of wood smoke and boiled greens. You're perched on a worn bench outside your cottage, gently gnawing the end of your chew stick, when your neighbor Ambrose shuffles by. He's older, mouth half gone, and as cheerful as a man with 5 teeth can be. He raises a crooked finger. Heard you've taken up twig chewing. Next thing we know, you'll be a tooth doctor. You laugh, mostly because Ambrose's laugh sounds like a donkey hiccuping through a bucket. But his joke gets you thinking. In the great theatre of medieval life, there's always someone filling the gaps, literal and metaphorical. And when it came to gaps in smiles, some people tried to fill them with, well, whatever they could find. Let's talk medieval tooth replacements. Now, to be clear, if you lost a tooth in the Middle Ages, most people just accepted it. You adapted, mashed your food, and occasionally whistled through the gap. But for those with status, wealth, or just sheer vanity, there were options. Crude, creative, occasionally terrifying. The earliest attempts at dental prosthetics were more symbolic than functional. Rich individuals, particularly nobles and royalty, sometimes had replacement teeth made from ivory, wood, or bone. These weren't for chewing. They were for appearances, meant to be shown during ceremonies, portraits, or awkward court flirting. They didn't fit well. They often weren't even shaped like human teeth. One noblewoman was rumored to wear a carved walnut shell inside her cheek during public events, to give her face a plumper, more toothy look. Historians still argue whether it was fashion, function, or a deeply misunderstood snack. Sometimes, actual human teeth were used. You heard right. Teeth from the recently deceased were occasionally harvested and fitted into the mouths of the living. It's not as common as folklore suggests, but it happened. Grave robbers, battlefield scavengers, and desperate physicians all dabbled in the trade. The results? Mixed. Infection, rejection, and deeply uncomfortable dinner conversation. In parts of Italy and France, there are scattered records of early dentures made from metal bands with teeth, either carved or natural, wired into them. These contraptions were fastened to remaining teeth or strapped to the face with ribbons. Comfort was not the goal. Visibility was. One physician, writing in the late 14th century, described a smile plate that attached via leather cords looped around the ears. It held 3 ivory incisors and a half-pearl molar, and was to be worn only while reciting poetry or engaging in noble games. You suspect noble games didn't include chewing mutton. In Jewish communities, where burial practices forbade disturbing the dead, false teeth were more likely to be carved from wood or stone. Some clever artisans fashioned them to fit like puzzle pieces between natural teeth. They didn't work especially well, but they looked impressive, for about 3 minutes, until your spit turned them into mush. And let's not forget the DIY enthusiasts. In every village, there's someone who swears they can fix that smile. Maybe they're a woodcarver who dabbles. Maybe they're a tinker with a soft spot for molars. Either way, they'll make you something. It might be a single tooth strapped with twine. It might be a full row glued with pine resin. Either way, you'll look like someone who lost a bar fight with a puppet. Some of these attempts were surprisingly clever. Fish bones shaped into wedges. Tiny bits of lead hammered into tooth shapes. Wax molds. It's the medieval equivalent of dental cosplay. You once met a man who swore by his goosebone incisor. Said it brought him luck and never failed to impress the ladies. The ladies, for the record, looked mostly horrified. But points for confidence. And yet, for every failed contraption, for every rotting grave tooth, there's a whisper of progress. People were trying, innovating, carving teeth from animal tusk, experimenting with gold bands, exploring the delicate art of pretending to be whole. Because missing teeth weren't just a health issue, they were social markers. They said something about age, poverty, illness. And in a world where appearances mattered, at court, at church, at market, having a full smile meant power, even if it was just a facade strapped on with leather and hope. Tonight, as you clean your chew stick and feel the gentle relief of a less angry mouth, you smile crookedly. Not because your teeth are perfect, but because they're yours. Still real. Still rooted, mostly. And if someday they start to fall out, well, maybe you'll ask the carpenter down the road to carve you something simple. Nothing flashy. Just enough to make the kids believe you once had a mouth like a saint. The next day arrives with the smell of damp earth and the sound of someone's rooster clearly misunderstanding what dawn is. You stretch, rub the side of your jaw, it's sore, but not screaming, and step outside to a sky that looks like wet wool. Perfect weather for staying indoors, sipping broth, and digging through the dusty corners of memory. Because today, you're thinking about stories. Not the ones carved in cathedral stone or chanted by monks in golden robes. But the stories passed down in whispers, in kitchen corners, in the long quiet moments between supper and sleep. Stories where teeth, of all things, make their mark. Let's start with saints. Medieval saints are everywhere, carved in wood, painted on walls, woven into tapestries. And they're not just spiritual figures, they're medical case studies. There's Saint Apollonia, for example, the patron saint of toothaches. Her story? Brutal. According to legend, she was tortured during a Roman uprising, and her teeth were violently pulled out before she was burned alive. Gruesome, yes, but somehow she became a symbol of comfort. People prayed to her during toothaches, clutched her relics, which sometimes included, yes, bits of teeth, and even recited specific rhymes to soothe the pain. Blessed Apollonia, ease this fire, cool my tooth and kill the pyre. It wasn't exactly Latin verse, but desperate mouths rarely quibble about poetry. Her image became a staple in churches and homes, often shown holding a pair of forceps with a giant tooth gripped inside. It's both holy and horrifying. But it gave people a target for their pain, a divine figure who understood suffering at the root, literally. And then there were the legends. In some parts of Britain, it was said that if you buried your tooth under a hawthorn tree and whispered a secret into the bark, the pain would leave your body and live in the tree instead. Let it root where the thorn does, they'd say. You can't prove it worked, but you can find old hawthorn trees with suspiciously lumpy soil beneath them. In Ireland, tales swirled of tooth fairies, though not the winged, sparkling kind. These were small, grim creatures that stole teeth from sleeping children and replaced them with pebbles or rabbit bones. You left your tooth under a stone, not your pillow, and hoped for something less weird in return. Some say these myths were born of fear of pain, of losing parts of yourself, of aging. But they also reflect a kind of desperate creativity. When medicine fails, people turn to stories. And stories, in turn, offer rituals, comfort, and, occasionally, just enough distraction to get through the night. Even folktales get in on the dental drama. Witches with iron teeth. Giants who sharpen theirs on mountains. wolves with fangs that sparkle like daggers in moonlight. Teeth become tools of power, terror, magic. In one Eastern European story, a young woman defeats a demon by pulling its tooth and planting it in her garden, where it grows into a tree that only bears fruit for the kind-hearted. In these tales, a tooth is never just enamel. It's memory, power, a seed, a weapon, sometimes a promise. And you've heard the tales the old folks tell when the wine's gone sour and the fire's burned low. About tooth curses, like the baker who bragged too loudly about his pearly whites and woke up with a mouth full of thorns. Or the tailor who wished for a smile as bright as gold and found his teeth turning to coins, one painful molar at a time. Historians still argue whether these tales were morality lessons or coping mechanisms. Probably both. But they tell you something important: teeth mattered. Enough to become characters in stories. Enough to inspire superstition, prayer, and even songs. Oh yes, songs. There's an old lullaby your grandmother hummed when your gums were sore. Close your mouth, my little dear, let the pain float far from here. To the sky or to the stream, let your teeth stay sweet in dream. You used to think it was just nonsense. Now you understand the tenderness behind it. In a world without clean tools or painkillers, sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer a hurting child was a song. Tonight, as the wind slips through the cracks in your shutters and the coals glow low in the hearth, you hum that song to yourself. Quiet. Simple. A little sad. But full of care. Because in the Middle Ages, teeth weren't just bones in your mouth. They were symbols. Fears. Blessings. Tiny, painful, priceless pieces of your story. A hard frost settles overnight, crisping the edges of every thatched roof and turning your breath into little ghosts with each exhale. You huddle closer to the fire, your jaw wrapped in a wool cloth not just for pain but for warmth. And as the village slowly wakes, a thought creeps in with the dawn light: how much of what people believed about their teeth was passed down, wrongly? Because even in an age where knowledge comes from scrolls and sermons, bad information spreads like smoke, especially when it's wrapped in confidence and rhyming couplets. You start to remember all the tips you've heard over the years. Like the woman who insisted that biting a copper coin each morning would strengthen the mouth bones. Or the shepherd who swore that chewing wool made your gums immune to decay. It didn't. It just made his breath smell like wet sheep. Let's dive into the delightful realm of medieval dental misinformation. One common belief: that blackening teeth was a sign of strength. In some areas, particularly during specific outbreaks, people darkened their teeth on purpose using soot or charcoal, convinced it prevented illness. Sick teeth are white teeth, they'd mutter ominously. You're fairly certain someone just hated smiling. Then there's the practice of using urine as a mouth rinse. Yes, you read that correctly. Aged urine, to be precise. Some Roman and medieval texts recommend rinsing the mouth with stale urine as a way to whiten teeth and fight infection. The logic: urine contains ammonia, which is mildly cleansing. The reality? It's revolting, unsanitary, and probably worse for your breath than doing nothing. And let's not forget the garlic rub. Garlic is powerful stuff, antibacterial, pungent, delicious in stew. But rubbing raw garlic directly onto an aching tooth was a go-to remedy for many medieval folks. Sometimes it helped. Other times, it just burned the gum tissue and made your face smell like you'd been in a fistfight with dinner. One monk even suggested placing a dead mole's tooth under your pillow to absorb mouth rot. No one can explain how he discovered this. You suspect a combination of boredom, desperation, and possibly poor eyesight. Historians still argue whether some of these remedies were symbolic, meant to ward off evil, or if people genuinely thought a burnt onion shoved up one's nostril would cure dental abscesses. Spoiler, it didn't. But it did clear the sinuses. Another myth held that sleeping with your mouth open would allow spirits to steal your voice through your teeth. So, people tied their jaws shut with ribbons at night. Imagine drifting off, only to be rudely awakened by your own makeshift mouth muzzle slipping and smacking your chin. You'd dream of demons and dental appointments. And then there were the powders. Not all were bad. Some, like those made from sage and salt, probably helped. But others, crushed brick, burned bones, lead filings, things no modern mouth should meet. You'd rub these powders onto your teeth with a cloth or finger, hoping for a cleaner smile and often ending up with inflamed gums and regrets. Even the idea of tooth cooling was a thing. You were told never to drink cold water after a hot meal, lest your teeth contract with shock and crack like pottery. One man claimed his cousin's teeth exploded after drinking well water too quickly. You suspect embellishment, but still sip carefully, just in case. Why did these beliefs persist? Because science was scarce, and suffering was constant. When pain strikes and no clear cure exists, people turn to anything that might work, even if it involves rodent teeth, boiled herbs, or chanting under the moon. Even now, some of those old wives' tales echo in your own habits. You still rub your cheek clockwise when it aches. Still hum that same lullaby. Still chew your food evenly on both sides, not because of balance, but because your grandmother swore it kept the mouth spirits calm. It's easy to laugh at these myths. Easier still to forget that, for centuries, they were the only instructions people had. Passed down like heirlooms. Memorized before bedtime. Recited during storms and plagues and long winters. And oddly, some weren't that far off. The garlic, mildly antibacterial. The chew sticks, legitimately effective. Even the idea that anxiety could trigger dental pain wasn't entirely wrong. Your body speaks in whispers, and sometimes the mouth is where it starts to shout. Tonight, you spit your rinse into the grass, tie your shawl tighter, and smile at the absurdity of it all. Because you're still here. Gums sore, teeth uneven, stories crowding your brain like sheep in a pen. And somehow, even with all the confusion, the contradictions, and the occasional squirrel tooth necklace, you've managed to keep your smile, crooked, yes, but defiantly yours. The frost has melted, the mud is everywhere, and your mouth, well, it's holding steady. But as you stare into your cup of lukewarm ale and gnaw thoughtfully on a piece of boiled barley bread, your thoughts begin to turn toward something unexpected: vanity. Because for all the practicality of toothache remedies, chew sticks, and herbal rinses, there's another reason people cared about their teeth: they wanted to look good. Yes, even in the Middle Ages. Perhaps especially in the Middle Ages, when first impressions mattered and a smile, however incomplete, could charm, deceive, or inspire trust. Let's start with courtly love. At the castles of nobles and royals, love was often a performance. Smiles, sighs, side glances, it was a dance of manners and metaphors, and teeth played their part. Pale, even teeth were associated with beauty and youth. Poets described their lovers as having teeth like milk pearls, or a smile whiter than snow on the convent roof. Of course, these poets conveniently ignored the reality. Most medieval mouths looked more like gravel paths than rows of pearls. But the ideal was set, and people aimed for it however they could. For the rich, this meant cosmetic rituals. Some nobles used herbal mouthwashes not for health, but for appearance. A mixture of sage, vinegar, and honey was popular. It gave the mouth a brighter sheen, and the vinegar whitened teeth slightly, at the cost of eroding enamel, though no one knew that at the time. You just thought you were dazzling. Others powdered their teeth with crushed charcoal or dried rosemary. The idea was to absorb odors and brighten the smile. Sometimes, these powders were tinted pink with rose petals, giving the mouth a healthy flush. Subtle, sweet-smelling, and probably better than the fish breath most folks carried. And then there were the wealth displays. Gold teeth. Yes, they existed. Not like modern grills, but more like dental jewelry. In some Italian courts, men and women capped damaged teeth with thin gold plates, not for function, but for show. It said, "I can afford to gild my problems." One Venetian noble famously wore a front incisor crafted from gold and ivory, engraved with a family crest. Historians still debate whether he could actually chew. Even beyond nobility, vanity crept in. Village festivals brought out everyone's best: clothes, manners, smiles. You'd see young lads chewing parsley or mint before courting, hoping to cover the scent of onions and nervous sweat. Girls whispered about whose teeth were still mostly whole, and older women recommended rubbing apple skin against your teeth before dancing. It gave them a polished look. For an hour. Maybe. In some regions, tooth gaps were considered charming, evidence of laughter, age, or character. In others, they were hidden behind veils or fans. A toothy grin could be flirtatious or foolish, depending on the context. It was all about delivery. Even monks, those paragons of ascetic living, weren't immune. You've heard stories of scribes who painted their teeth with herbal dye to look more humble or less tempting. One particularly vain friar was said to have rubbed ash into his gums to give himself the look of perpetual fasting. Either that or he just liked scaring the choir boys. Historians still argue whether these cosmetic habits were widespread or limited to the elite. Likely both. Fashion always trickles down. A noble dyes their teeth with mint water, and a week later, a fishmonger tries it with pond scum. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you just get sick. But it's not just about looking good, it's about signaling. Clean teeth meant you cared. About hygiene, about status, about the people around you. Rotten teeth, on the other hand, were often associated with sin. Greed, gluttony, sloth, all found their metaphor in the crumbling molar. Priests preached about mouths full of rot as symbols of moral decay. So tonight, after you finish your meal, you find yourself reaching for that mint sprig, not just for your breath, but for the feeling of being presentable. You chew, rinse, and check your reflection in the water basin. Your teeth aren't perfect, but they're clean. Mostly. And that, in this world, is something to smile about. Because even in an age of famine and filth, of superstition and surgical guesswork, people still want to look good. To smile at a lover. To laugh at a joke. To flash a grin and say, "Yes, I still have most of them, thank you very much." And honestly, isn't that kind of beautiful? The village bell tolls slowly as dusk creeps in, and you wander back from the fields with aching feet and that ever-present whisper in your jaw that says, "You probably slept funny again." Your chew stick is now more friend than tool, and your rinsing routine has become as natural as scratching behind your ear. But tonight, your thoughts wander away from your own mouth and toward something bigger. How did other cultures, beyond your foggy little village, tackle the whole teeth situation? Because you may be stuck in a thatched roof world of barley and mint water, but elsewhere, they had their own tricks, traditions, and, occasionally, actual breakthroughs. Let's start far east. In China, dental care had a surprisingly early start. As early as 500 BCE, texts like the Huangdi Neijing, essentially a massive medical encyclopedia, discuss oral hygiene, gum health, and tooth preservation. The Chinese used chewing sticks too, but also developed early forms of tooth powder made from ginseng, salt, and herbs. They even understood, to a degree, the connection between dental health and overall wellness, a concept still gaining traction in some modern circles. They also practiced a form of rudimentary orthodontic. Archaeological findings suggest the use of gold wire to stabilize loose teeth. Gold wire. Meanwhile, you're here using sheep wool and prayers. Makes you think. India, too, had a long tradition of oral care rooted in Ayurvedic medicine. Ancient texts recommended brushing with neem twigs, antibacterial and bitter, perfect for keeping the mouth clean. They also stressed tongue scraping and oil pulling, swishing sesame oil around the mouth to draw out toxins. Sounds weird? Maybe. But modern research suggests oil pulling can reduce plaque and bacteria. So score one for the ancients. Islamic culture, particularly during the Islamic Golden Age, championed cleanliness, including oral hygiene. The miswak, a twig from the Salvadora persica tree, was praised not only by physicians but by the Prophet Muhammad himself. It was used to clean the teeth before prayer, after waking, before sleep, basically any time a modern person would pull out a toothbrush. The result? Some of the cleanest mouths in the medieval world. Muslim scholars like Al-Zarawi wrote extensively on dental surgery, describing tools and techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern textbook, minus the anesthesia, of course. He outlined procedures for removing tooth decay, stabilizing loose teeth, and even wiring fractured jaws. His work traveled west via translation and influenced European medicine, though, predictably, it took Europe a few hundred years to really catch on. In Japan, dental care had its own unique flair. People used branches from specific trees, powdered charcoal, and, for the wealthy, tooth blackening. Yes, blackening. Called ohaguro, it involved dyeing the teeth with a mixture of iron filings and vinegar. It sounds counterintuitive, but it was fashionable, seen as a sign of beauty and maturity, particularly among aristocrats and samurai. Imagine flashing a row of perfectly black teeth as a sign of sophistication. You'd cause a scandal at your local tavern. Across Africa, oral hygiene varied widely by region, but chew sticks were a common thread, often made from licorice or walnut trees. These were valued not just for cleaning but for their pleasant taste. Some tribes had complex rituals around dental care, including tooth filing and decorative extraction. Painful? undoubtedly, but culturally significant, and sometimes even surprisingly sterile, thanks to the antiseptic properties of the woods used. The indigenous peoples of the Americas also maintained oral hygiene using natural tools. In some areas, ashes were used to clean the mouth. In others, fibrous plants doubled as floss. Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya practiced advanced dental modification, filing teeth into shapes, inlaying jade or turquoise, and creating jaw adornments that were less about health and more about status. You can't help but picture a young Mayan noble flashing a jade-inlaid canine and thinking, "Take that, Europe." Historians still argue whether these practices were more aesthetic or functional, but there's no denying that many were way ahead of their time. While you're nervously boiling mint leaves and hoping the clove kicks in, people across the globe were engineering smiles with surprising sophistication. Even among the Norse, notorious for their rough living, archaeologists have found surprisingly clean teeth. Low-sugar diets, combined with chew tools and perhaps a healthy fear of Loki, kept their mouths in better shape than many of their medieval counterparts. And in Icelandic sagas, warriors are sometimes described as bright-toothed, suggesting cleanliness was not only practiced but admired. Tonight, you sit by your fire, chew stick gently fraying, and think about all those distant mouths. The ones blackened for beauty, wired for strength, inlaid with jewels or cleaned with oils. They may have spoken different languages, followed different gods, and eaten very different meals, but they all shared one thing: the same battle against decay, pain, and the eternal hope for just one more tooth. And somehow, knowing you're part of that global, century-spanning struggle makes your own aching molar feel a little less lonely. The days are shortening now, shadows stretching longer across the cobblestone paths, and your breath clouds in the chill air like soft smoke. You wrap yourself tighter in your cloak, lips tucked in against the cold, and there it is again, your teeth. Constant companions, even when they protest every bite of hardened bread. But something's changed. It's not that your mouth is suddenly perfect, far from it. But you've grown accustomed to its rhythms, its complaints, its quiet moments of peace. You've learned to care for it in ways your younger self wouldn't have imagined: powders, sticks, rinses, rest. You've even passed your methods to others. Children now chew twigs after meals. Your neighbor's mother tried your rosemary rinse and hasn't stopped talking about it since. And it hits you, slowly, like the warmth from an embering hearth, that you've become something unexpected. A kind of village mouthkeeper. People come to you now. Quietly, humbly. They tap your door and ask about tooth pain, bad breath, gum sores. They show you gaps in their smile, hoping for guidance. Not because you wear robes or carry relics, but because you've lived through the worst of it and come out still able to grin. So you share what you know. You brew small pouches of dried mint and clove for rinses. You show them how to soften a chew stick just right. You explain, gently, that no, crushing a garlic bulb into honey and sleeping with it in your mouth will not make the pain go away faster. And if it does, it's probably just because you passed out from the smell. You start keeping a little basket of tools by your fire: twigs, cloth, powdered salt, and sage. It's not a clinic. It's not magic. But it's something. And in a world where so much feels out of your control, storms, taxes, cows with attitudes, this small mastery feels like a blessing. Word spreads. One afternoon, a traveling merchant from 2 villages over stops at your door. He's got a painful swelling in his jaw and a look of someone who's ready to remove his own head with a soup ladle. You sit him down, brew your warm rinse, and teach him how to press a hot cloth to the swelling. "Clove," you whisper. "It doesn't fix it, but it helps." He thanks you, leaves a coin on your table, and promises to return with more mint when spring comes. Another day, a mother brings her daughter whose first tooth has fallen out. "We don't have hawthorn trees," she says nervously. "What should we do with it?" You take a small pot of earth from your herb window and tell the child to bury it there, whispering something kind to the soil. "It will grow into strength," you say. The girl nods. You're not sure she believes you, but you say it anyway, because belief is its own kind of medicine. People begin to call you the tooth keeper. Not officially, not formally, just quietly, when they think you're not listening. And even though you laugh and shake your head and insist you're just an old person with good herbs, you feel the weight of it. The honor. The quiet reverence for something so often dismissed as mundane. Because tooth care, you realize, is more than hygiene. It's dignity. It's survival. It's the ability to speak clearly, to eat without wincing, to smile without fear. In a world full of noise and suffering and sudden loss, keeping one's teeth, even just a few, is a victory. So now, when your jaw aches, you don't curse it. Not as much, anyway. You heat your cloth. You chew your mint. You hum that lullaby. And you remind yourself that this small act, this tending of the self, is a rebellion against decay, silence, and despair. It's life, in its simplest, most stubborn form. Snow falls in slow, deliberate flakes, drifting like ash from an unseen fire above. The village is quiet, wrapped in that peculiar hush that only winter brings, the kind where every sound seems muffled by wool and memory. You sit by your hearth, chewing gently on a softened twig, and watch the coals glow like tiny suns. Your mouth isn't perfect. A few teeth have gone. One aches when the cold sinks in too deep. But still, you eat. Still, you speak. Still, you smile, now more out of habit than self-consciousness. You've survived. And in surviving, you've become the keeper of something more than old herbs and twigs. You've become a witness to the quiet, stubborn ways medieval people fought back against pain, against rot, against time itself. Not with magic. Not with miracles. But with clove buds and miswak twigs. With honey-soaked linen and whispered prayers. With trial, error, and enough creativity to make even a saint wince. There's a knock at your door, slow, respectful. A young boy from the edge of the village. He holds out a pouch. "My DA's tooth," he says. "Hurts bad. Won't sleep. Mam says you'll know what to do." You nod, take the pouch, and pull together a mixture of crushed sage and mint, warmed slightly in the hearth's edge. You tell the boy to make his DA swish it gently, then bite on a bit of soft cloth. Tell him not to chew anything harder than mashed turnips, you say with a smile. The boy hesitates. Will it fix it? No, you reply gently. But it'll make him feel like someone cares. That's what it's really about, isn't it? Caring. Not curing. Not conquering. Just showing up for your mouth, day after day, with whatever tools the world has to offer. Even if those tools include goose fat, a twig, and the jawbone of a mole. You remember all the things you've learned, How to use herbs not just to mask pain, but to soothe it. How chew sticks and powders passed down through generations could do what no blade could. How even in places without wealth or science, people still found ways to protect what mattered. Teeth weren't just bones, they were tools, signals, signs of life. And as the snow thickens outside, you think of all the mouths that came before you. The villagers, the nobles, the poets and peasants. All chewing, rinsing, praying. All scraping by, literally. Historians may still argue over what worked and what didn't. Whether those ancient remedies were brilliance or desperation. Whether people truly believed in mouth spirits or just needed something to blame when things hurt. But you know this, they survived. With wool wrapped tight, and gums stained with clove, and laughter echoing through gaps in their smiles, they survived. And now, so have you. You stretch your legs toward the fire, lean your head back, and let the warmth climb up your spine. Outside, the wind sighs gently through the shutters. Inside, your breath slows. Peaceful. Even. Because in this long, strange journey from toothache to toothkeeper, you've found something better than perfection, you've found enough. And now, as the final embers settle and the hush of night thickens around your cottage like a soft wool blanket, you breathe in the stillness. Let your jaw rest. Let your thoughts loosen, drifting gently like smoke curling upward from a dying candle. You've walked through centuries tonight, through pain, ritual, laughter, and law. You've survived toothaches and tinctures, stood in village markets and holy halls, knelt by hearths with sprigs of mint and bowls of soot. You've learned the language of survival, the quiet wisdom passed from hand to hand, mouth to mouth. There's something peaceful about it, isn't there? This idea that care doesn't always come from brilliance or invention, but from rhythm, routine, and gentle persistence. Just one more rinse. One more chew. One more whispered remedy under your breath. And maybe, as you drift into sleep, you'll carry some of that simplicity with you. Not just in your dreams, but in the quiet ways you treat yourself tomorrow. So rest now. Let your body sink into warmth. Let the night hum around you, gentle and low. The pain is softer now. The shadows, kinder. Your mouth still aches in places, yes, but it's yours. It's familiar. It's tended. And in this quiet moment, that's more than enough.